and hello and welcome back to most of you who had a long day. I know quite a few faces here were here for most of the day. It is my pleasure to introduce the last panel, which should be a little different, less formal lectures and more of discussion. That's what I don't look like this.
You want us to be less formal?
Less formal. That's why I took off my tie. So we are really, but only last night. That's right. So after having heard already a little bit about possibilities of Israeli future, the possibility in the last panel of millions of Africans and Asian Jews, or as some would call it, wannabe Jews, who would immigrate, the possibility of a very fast-growing Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Haredi community in Israel, and other options. We will explore this a little bit more and try to look or explore how Israel might look 20 years from now. If you remember, those of you who have read Alt Neuland, that was what Herzl looked into the future, how a land not yet called Israel then would look 20 years in the future. That was in the beginning of the 20th century. Today, of course, it's a very different situation, and we have three excellent panelists here who it's my pleasure to introduce. First, we'll hear from Professor Fania Oz-Salzberger, who is a professor at the University of Haifa, where she teaches actually a lot of things: early modern history, especially early modern British history. But she also teaches German studies. She also was a professor for Israel studies at Monash University in Melbourne. She has published basically on all of these topics. She published a book which is just coming out in the second edition on Israelis in Berlin. She published it even before there were Israelis in Berlin. But
I invented
you
Israelis
invented
in Berlin.
them. That came out 2001, and most of the Israelis only arrived there in the last 10 years. So another book she wrote recently together with Amos Oz is Jews and Words, a wonderful book. For those of you not familiar, I can really very much recommend it. And most recently, she published, co-edited together with Yedidia Stern, whom we had here last year for a conference, an article, a book very much on our topic as well, The Israeli Nation State. After Dr. Oz-Salzberger, we'll hear from Professor James Loeffler. James Loeffler is Professor of History and Jewish Studies at the University of Virginia. He is the author of The Most Musical Nation, Jews and Culture in the Late Russian Empire, which won so many awards I can't even list them and read them here. He is currently completing two books, one called Rooted Cosmopolitans, Human Rights and Jewish Politics in the 20th Century, and an edited volume, The Law of Strangers, Jewish Lawyering and International Law in Historical Perspectives. And in both of the books, Zionism actually, I think, plays a pretty large role. And our third speaker, Dr. Mohamed Vatad, is a legal scholar specializing in international comparative criminal law, comparative constitutional law, and he is a graduate of Haifa University's School of Law. He also studied at Oxford University and holds a Master of Law degree from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He's currently an assistant professor at Tzfat Academic College, School of Law in Israel. He's also editor-in-chief of the international journal Medicine and Law, and currently a visiting professor at the University of California at Irvine. I should also mention that just this year, he was the winner of the Best Young Scholar Award on Israel Studies, which is awarded by the Association for Israel Studies. So I think we have a lively group here with different, hopefully some different opinions. And I would ask each of you to talk for 10 to maximum 15 minutes, so we'll have more chance of an open discussion.
Thank you very much, Michael. Can everybody hear me? I don't expect you to see me, but at least I hope you can hear me. Let me say, first of all, how happy I am to be here once again, thanking Pam, thanking Michael, thanking, of course, Laura, for this wonderful hospitality and opportunity. I love the audience. I'm beginning to know the audience. It's great being here. This is such a better place compared to New York City. You have no idea. I also want to say what a pleasure it is to sit next to a graduate of my faculty, my law school. I hope I don't sound too motherly, Muhammad, but you know, it's such a good feeling. You know, the Talmud has it, "Bakol Adam mekaneh chutz mibno vetalmido," which means a person can be jealous of anyone except for their son and their pupil. Now, I know some people who have managed to pull it off to be jealous of their kids or their pupils, but I feel so proud, and it's such nachas. And now I'm supposed to talk about the future of Israel in 20 years' time. Are you serious?
In less than 20 minutes.
In less than 20 minutes? Are you serious?
Well, I should say one thing. She gave the inspiration because you published an article about it.
I know. But that was Israel in 10 years' time. And now you want to... Yeah, Politico.com just opened a subsidiary to Politico Europe, and they have this thing, what will things look like in 2025? And I was commissioned to write the Israel in 2025, and I gave 3 scenarios. I'll be discussing them here, but I want to give you some new stuff. So let me begin with a midrash, which I just invented for you, totally new and fresh. You see, back home in Israel, whenever anybody is asked to prophesize the future, we can fall back on this extremely convenient Talmudic phrase, "Hanevuah nitna leshotim," which means in English, prophecy is the realm of fools, or prophecy has been given to fools, except that most people don't remember the full sentence. And the full Talmudic quote is, ever since מאז שחרב בית המקדש, ever since the destruction of the temple, prophecy has been given to fools. That is before, when the temple was still standing, when the world was right, when civil society was still in order, reasonable people were able to prophesize. Great minds were able to prophesize. Those are the biblical prophets. Only after the destruction of the temple, when the world went totally wrong, totally berserk, only then was the prophecy given to fools. Now, does this remind you of anything else? World literature, not necessarily Jewish? Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. A tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. I'm quoting from memory, Tudor, did I get it right? A tale told by an idiot. The prophecy was given to fools, but this only happens after Macbeth has unhinged the orderly world. After the universe has gone mad. It's the equivalent, the Shakespearean equivalent, of the destruction of the temple. When the world is gone mad, only fools can prophesize. Tales are told by idiots. But if the world is set back to rights, maybe some of us more reasonable boys and girls can actually prophesize. And for me, you know, thank goodness the temple in Jerusalem has not been rebuilt, and I'm not sure I want it to be rebuilt in the immediate future, because that would be a tad problematic. But I do feel that I live in a world fast changing, but with enough inner logic to hazard a couple of thoughts about the future, which hopefully would not be a tale told by an idiot. Let's give it a try, and you will be the judge. Okay, so this was my midrash for you. I think there are 3 basic scenarios of what Israel will look like in 10 or 20 years from now. And I want to begin with the worst scenario, continue with the second worst and finish within less than 20 minutes, God willing, and I'm a secular, but I need some help here, with the best possible scenario. Let me spell this out. There's no easy way to say this. The worst scenario is Israel being destroyed within the coming 20 years. Destroyed by some major catastrophe. Let's call it metaphorically the Iranian bomb. It can be either the Iranian bomb or something that the Iranian bomb is a metaphor for. You see, back home, I'm known as a lefty. And you know what? I am a lefty. I wouldn't say it out loud walking in the streets of Jerusalem today, but here I'm telling you that. But I'm not a starry-eyed lefty. I'm not willing to pretend that danger out there is not real, that evil is not real. There is danger, there is evil, and I would not be respecting my own rational legacy. I come from a long line of misnogdim, of Lithuanian, level-headed, non-mystical, learned Jews. I would be betraying my lineage if I did not say that there is some possibility, some viability to this worst-case scenario. Maybe, this is the worst of my nightmares, Bibi Netanyahu is right and the Iranian bomb is a real danger. By the way, my worst nightmare is not that the Iranian bomb is real, but that Bibi Netanyahu is right. But you know, we do have, this is a scenario. I concede it, I respect it, I don't think it's very likely, but we need to put this on the table. For honesty's sake, for intellectual integrity's sake, we need to use our imagination not just for hope and optimism and a new horizon, but also for the worst-case scenario. Imagination is not meant only for hope. Imagination is also meant for the worst-case scenario. Let's face it. So I'm a non-starry-eyed lefty, and that's because probably I hail from a long line of staunch, shtetl, Jewish women who made a mean chicken soup and did not trust anybody. So you can be a lefty for all you want in Israel, and you know, social democrat and a liberal and hopeful and globalized and secular and what have you, and you still have this Jewish mother in you. When you make chicken soup, you really worry about the future of your grandchildren and so on. So this is my first scenario. I don't have a lot of intelligent stuff to say about it. It might not be the Iranian bomb. It might be some other brewing catastrophe. Earlier we spoke of unintended consequences, of which we do not yet have a clear picture. It might be a climatic catastrophe. Part of the Middle East, we are told, might become climatically uninhabitable. There would be a new Völkerwanderung, what's the English name for it? A new wandering of peoples. We in Israel, our tiny little space in the Middle East, might not be able to resist this demographic pressure. Who knows? This is the catastrophic scenario, and that's all I can tell you about it. I respect it, I keep it on board. But the other two are more interesting, because the other two depend far more on free will. And Zionism from the start, and this is one characteristic that Zionism today is fast losing, to my great regret. But the Zionism of my four grandparents was based on the very deeply secular notion, but it also has a religious Jewish corollary, that history is made by men and women, that we can change the world. Herzl's Zionism was man-made, and to some degree woman-made. The kind of labor, kibbutz Zionism I hail from, was totally man-made. Nes lo kara lanu. We are not based on miracles. We simply rose and decided to leave East Europe, Central Europe, North Africa, Iraq, Yemen, and to gather in the ancestral land as a man-made change of fate. So history is in human hands. This is the way I was educated. Today, an increasing number of Israelis are letting go of this notion, to my regret. But I still believe in it. So my second worst scenario, how am I doing? Do I have 5 minutes for each scenario?
5 minutes total.
What? Okay.
You want to give some time to your other panelists.
But I
Your
do. How can I not? So I'll put it briefly. The second scenario is simply that extremism takes over in Israel as it does in the neighborhood. And that people like myself who are already being aggressively marginalized will become even more aggressively marginalized. And here I want quickly to say that Israel studies in general, including this conference, are a little behind times. We are still fighting ghosts, and we are still trying to butcher holy cows which are long dead. For me, it's a waste of time, almost a waste of time, even for scholars. To try to show that Ben-Gurion was not a saint, or that old labor Zionism was hegemonic, all this is dead. The holy cows are dead. There are new holy cows now, not the ones that used to be the hegemony in the old times. And that is why I'm not worried about, as I said in New York the other day, I'm not worried about worshipping Ben-Gurion and Rabin today. I'm worried about demonizing Ben-Gurion and Rabin today, because this is the common voice, at least in the Israeli internet sphere, in the social network. There is a huge level of aggressiveness. Now, I'm all in favor of Jewish verbal quarreling. I wrote a whole book along with my father on which we quarreled a lot, that Jews and words are about disagreements, putting disagreements into words, and this is what kept us going for 3,000 years, assuming there is no God. I am worried today that those verbal disagreements will again, as they did exactly 20 years ago, deteriorate into a real street-level violence. I am beginning to be worried. And I think the greatest democratic deficit in Israel's history is not, as some people have claimed, the fact that Arab Israelis were unfortunately under emergency rules until the early 60s, or the fact that there is no full civil equality today. All these are very bothering. But they are not the real democratic deficit. The real democratic deficit is that our schools never taught their pupils what is proper democratic discourse. And that millions of Israelis today are unaware of how to conduct a conversation democratically in Israel. And the internet has blown this up. It was there before, but the internet has opened up all this very, very bothersome, very worrying violence of verbal exchange and absence of listening. In my second worst scenario, this kind of thing, call it extreme right wing, there is also a little bit of this in the extreme left, but especially in the extreme right, but I call it the unlistening, disrespectful, vulgar, undemocratic Israeli discourse which will take over. And then we will become yet another Middle Eastern country, maybe a tad less violent, maybe a tad less brutal and barbaric, but not somewhere I would want to live. I'm not sure I'll have the choice, but that's a different question. Third scenario, last 2 minutes. The third scenario is better. Yes, I am optimistic. Yes, I have hope. Yes, things don't look good now, but a lot of clocks are ticking at the same time. Not all of these clocks are covered for you by the media. Not all of these clocks are trendy and center stage in Israeli discourse today. But some good stuff is happening too. Many of my Arab students are moving center stage into Israel mainstream society. They are becoming, God forbid, bourgeois. This is great news. They are becoming my partners in civil society. A lot of kids in Israel today, like my own sons, are deeply idealistic and working hard on social issues. This is good news. They are not all sitting there playing computer games like their East Asian peers. They are out there working in Israeli society. A lot of good instincts. The kibbutz is not dead. The kibbutz is flowing genetically in the main arteries of Israeli society. Quest for justice, quest for equality, open discourse, all the good things. We need a leadership capable, and we do not have it right now, a leadership capable of reaching out to every moderate voice in the Middle East. And I will end by telling you, believe it or not, that there are moderate partners in the Middle East today. They are silent and awed by what we are witnessing, but they are there. Egyptian liberals, Gulf state pragmatists, North African state globalists, they are all there. Some of them are actively reaching out for us, even the Arab League. We need a leadership in Israel, and forget right and left. We can go back to that, if you like, in the discussion. We need a leadership capable of reaching out actively, assertively to the moderate voices in the Middle East. Is this doable? Yes. Will Israeli society live up to such a leadership? Will it respond to it? My short answer is yes. Out of my 3 scenarios, and assuming that prophecy was not given to the fools after all, not only do I stick by the last and more hopeful, but I pledge to work for it, and I'm already doing my best to work for it, and I'm not the only Israeli on the job. Thank you very much.
Jim, do you want to go next?
Sure. I also want to excuse me, echo the thanks to Michael and Pam and Laura for a wonderful conference. And you know, there's the Oscar Wilde joke, why didn't want to be a socialist, because there were too many meetings. And you know, sometimes with Israel and Israel events, both academic and non-academic, there's a feeling that there are too many. But happily, this is not the case. This is one where I feel like we really have engaged with, in a lot of different ways, very interesting, you know, in-depth perspectives, and not only talked about the surface issues. So now I'm going to try my nevuah. And it's, I think, even harder for me because I don't do as many things as our last speaker. I come much more out of a historical mode. And so I'm by nature more cautious about thinking about the future. And I'm also reminded, you know, of the first time when I was in graduate school in 2000, the first time I was a teaching assistant for an Israeli history course. And I remember when we got to the end of the course, asked the professor, how are you going to end the course? And he ended it by saying, Israeli history is over, in the sense that it's done. There's going to be peace. Israel's turning into America. The American cars are arriving. McDonald's, it's all here. It's done. Very much in the same way that people wrote about the end of history also, right, as a thesis, that sort of something had fundamentally happened. And of course, this was 2000, and then a lot of stuff happened beginning of that year. So I'm cautious about it. But let me try and take up the charge of briefly talking about what Israel might look like in 20 years. And I want to do it by talking about 4 moments, as I imagine moving out likewise from the present into the future, and how I imagine Israel. And I'll imagine it through 4 moments that I've experienced already, and I do almost every time I go to Israel, and imagining what they will look like to me and to others there in 20 years hence. The 4 moments, I'll call them, for simplicity's sake, mobility, money, law, and language. So mobility. This is obvious, but you learn a lot about a society when you arrive each time, and I'm always struck when I arrive in Israel by the passport control room, because it never ceases to strike me how many different languages you hear on any given day of people flowing in, not just French and Hebrew and Russian, Arabic, Chinese, all kinds of different languages. I think it's also interesting that it's often hard to predict who goes to go in the Israeli passport line and who goes in the foreign passport line, right? And you see people wander up to the Israeli passport line who are unable to speak in Hebrew, but they have their passports, and you see, families often of Israelis coming in the other line, or oftentimes they're holding both, right? Which brings me to my first observation, that I think, Israel is a country which is always on the move. Step away from politics, step away from what it will look like in terms of civil society. It's a society, a country with wanderlust in its heart. Israelis, we all know, are extremely mobile. They're in Berlin. They're everywhere. I read somewhere recently that 60,000 Israelis have taken out citizenship in Central and Eastern Europe, gotten passports there. in places that most of them and most people in this room would never want to live. But it's a way into EU citizenship, right? And we've all heard the statistics about 750,000 Israelis living abroad. Who knows exactly? But my point here is that I think we're only going to see more of that. I think we'll see more of that because there will be more European Jews who will come to Israel and do what some of them are doing now, which is take out citizenship and then go back to Europe, or work in Europe and live in Israel, or vice versa. I think this is a phenomenon we're going to see because it's a phenomenon that's true all over the world. It's true here too. We see it in this country. And I think we'll only see more of that as Israelis deal with, in one sense, the stress of living there and the desirability of living in Israel, but the wanderlust. It's no surprise I recently saw, one of the hit songs in Israeli music today is about a trip to South America, right? That it resonates because so many people do it. It's one of the amazing things. So you see that at the airport now, you'll see it then. It'll be a society of travelers. You get in the car, and I imagine the first thing I'll encounter is traffic, because there's always traffic. And if what happens, as we're told will happen in Tel Aviv, there'll be 20 years later, they'll still be digging the highway. It'll be worse than the big dig here in Boston. It'll be, you can only imagine. But so you ride you ride down the road, and I imagine myself going to Jerusalem. I imagine myself driving down Kvish Mespaer Achad, Highway number 1, and you're at the seam between east and west of Jerusalem. It's a place with a lot of pain right now. It's a very stark point of division in the city. And on one side is quote-unquote Jewish Jerusalem, and the other side is quote-unquote Arab Jerusalem. We could talk about those terms. But every time I drive down that, I'm reminded of one story that happened to me 20 years ago when I lived in Israel. And that was when I went with a friend to buy a mattress in Mea Shearim at a Haredi furniture store. And we put the mattress on the roof, and we started driving back. And halfway down the highway, we realized the mattress had flown off. So of course we went back, and everyone, this being Israel, shouted at us, "What are you doing in the road? Why are you standing there?" We never found the mattress. So the joke was, at this point, either there's a Haredi family to one side of us that's going to take this mattress home for 10 children for tonight to use, or there's a Palestinian Arab family with 10 children, also a poor family. They're going to make good use of the mattress, and we will find another mattress. I talk about the mattress because it's about money. And I think more, the divisions in Israeli society will be there. They'll be even worse in one sense. But I think the stratification will only grow. And I think what's interesting to remember is I think it will grow inside each of these different tribes or enclaves, right? So there's no doubt that, as Vanya tells us, there will be more and more of not an Israeli Arab sector, right? There will be people who are at the heart and the mainstream of parts of Israeli society who come from those backgrounds. And then there will also be what we would call an underclass that will only grow also. And I think this is true for Haredim. As we heard today, there'll be more and more Haredim who, for reasons of necessity or opportunity, will be moving into the mainstream economy, right? Moving into the army. And there will be, obviously, there'll be a core which will not. So I think we'll see in a weird way, money will splinter many of the different pockets or sectors or tribes, however we want to describe these parts of Israeli society. My hope is that this will lead to all kinds of interesting new connections and alliances between these groups that will break down some of these things. And I don't think it will be necessarily a liberal secular revival as all these people congregate there. I think there'll be more different kinds of coalitions and interests. But I'm not going to prognosticate any more about this. So there, in traffic, it brings me to the obvious thing that always happens, which is a traffic accident. I can tell you, guaranteed, there will be lots of traffic accidents in Israel in 20 years. They will still be around. So what will happen? And here's where I want to talk for a second about law. It strikes me that what we'll see in Israel is something that we see everywhere in the developed world, which is the growing role of law in shaping how people approach their own society. Israel will be more litigious. As we heard today, there may be more lawyers per capita there than any other country in the world. And I think that it's not just a question about the crisis of legitimacy of the court. We already see on the right and the left groups now beginning to say, if the political process doesn't work, let's try and use law to ban an NGO we don't like, or to assert our right to do something. I think it's also going to go another step, which is in the private sphere of people doing that. One of the sobering things that happened this week was the death of a man named Richard Lakin, right? So Richard Lakin was an American Jew who made Aliyah, lived there. All of these deaths are tragic. hits the news in a certain way because of his work with coexistence there. He was also the lead plaintiff in what I would consider to be a very interesting, bizarre lawsuit, right, filed by American and Israeli attorneys who are suing Facebook, right? So 20,000 Israeli citizens are suing Facebook for providing a platform for incitement. And they're saying if incitement is traveling through social media, Facebook should be held liable. There are a lot of other cases like this that have begun to develop. I've written a little bit about them because there's some bizarre cases in which Israelis are suing Chinese banks, and the Israeli government is trying to stop them, and the American government is trying to stop them. All kinds of strange things that are happening. This is what I call the privatization of lawfare. Right? Law becomes more and more a tool that people use when they feel frustrated that their own military or police can't defend them, when their government doesn't seem to do what they want. They turn to law as a creative way to expand its possibilities. This is something that's true here. I think it will only be more true there, and it could play out in all kinds of unpredictable ways, pinning different groups against one another and against the Israeli government itself. So I'm not going to dwell on that. It goes without saying we will see more and more lawsuits in international courts as well. And I think Mohammed could probably talk to us with much greater knowledge about where international law is going. But Israel will continue to be deeply engaged with that. It won't have a choice. And I think this privatization of it is bound to happen. So those are three different moments: the traffic accident, on the highway, the arrival. The last moment is for me, the saddest moment. And I often think I'd like to write an essay called The Saddest Moment for Me, which is every time I leave Israel. And I imagine it'll be the same in 20 years hence. It's not the leaving of Israel. It's not, for me, the sad part is not, as an American Jewish person, it's not letting go of Israel. It's not that I'm not staying there. It's the Israeli security screening. And I'll tell you why. Because whenever I go there, it becomes an absurd conversation where the security screener says to me, "Why do you speak Hebrew if you're an American?" And I say, "I'm a Jew, why wouldn't I speak Hebrew?" And they say, "Where did you go to synagogue? Where did you go to school? Why is your name James?" That's not a Jewish name, right? And they say, "Do you have children? Where do your children go to school? Do you have relatives?" And they do this. This is a screening protocol. I don't take that personally. But in another sense, it always strikes me that the strangeness that I should speak in Hebrew to this person is a sad thing, because it reflects both a success and a failure of Zionism. The success is that Zionism, something we haven't talked about, if we want to pat Zionism on the back, we can say more miraculous than the state of Israel, I don't know if you would agree, is the Hebrew revival. That you created people who could only communicate as a first language with each other in Hebrew, right? And that brought it into a living language. And it made it a language of millions of people who are not Jewish and don't have that tie, and made it a vessel for their creativity and their identity as well. That is an amazing fact. The failure of that is that it created a distance between Israel and the rest of the Jewish world. We all are at this conference because we're curious, and many of us concerned about the relationship between this part of the Jewish diaspora and Israel. And I think the Hebrew language question is something that I struggle to imagine how it could be better in 20 years. I remember 20 years back, when Rabin was killed, a friend of mine called me up. And this is a friend who is now a very prominent journalist in this town. And she had someone I knew from university. She was not very interested in Jewish causes. She was not very interested in Israel. Her politics made her suspicious of nationalism as a rule. But when that happened, she called me up, and what she wanted to do was, she didn't want to go to Israel, she wanted to learn Hebrew. And that was, for her, the way she would build her own relationship of equality in connection to Israel, without any other prejudgment about what she expected that relationship to mean, what her obligations were, what she wanted Israel to be. The language was going to be her way to connect to the society. She did not go on with that. And in one sense, she symbolizes many American Jews who feel a strong identification, a strong investment. Many of them feel strongly opposed to what they see in Israel, but I would argue are lacking a way to actually connect to that society. And it's the issue of language. So I don't have a grand prediction, but I wonder about what this conference would look like in 20 years hence, right? What it could look like, where American Jews will be, where people like me, people like my children will be in relationship to Israel. And we spend a lot of time in this country talking about the politicization, the polarization, the ways in which the right and the left and American Jews are split, and like this organization, that will all continue. I can guarantee that, right? American Jews are not going to agree more, they're going to agree less. But if I had a hope and a wish, it would be that we would also have a way to connect and to argue with one another and to argue with our fellow Israelis, not just in English, but in Hebrew. So maybe, just maybe, we'll see some of that in 20 years to come.
Good evening. Thank you for having me here. I'm both delighted and honored, and of course distinguished simply by sitting nearby Fania, whom I perceive really to be my mentor and teacher, as she was, as she is, and as she will be. It occurred to me during the last weekend that I spent about 10 hours in my office at UC Irvine, wondering why I was invited here. Apart from the fact, where is Professor Cutler, that I guess that she likes me and she made it for me to come here, I thought for a second it could be because of my name. Namely, I am named after Prophet Muhammad, and therefore I can be put in this session, thus bringing upon some prophecy. But Prophet Muhammad told us that he is going to be the last prophet. And Fania told us now that after the destruction of the Second Temple, there are no prophets, and he will argue to be a prophet. He is an idiot, and I don't want to be perceived as an idiot. So I'm sorry to disappoint you. I am not able and I'm not capable really to see the future, and I don't really know how Israel will look like in 2035. But since I was invited and I'm here, I would like to share with you my wishful thinking about how Israel should look like 20 years from now. I believe that Israel should look like its image as it was initially anticipated in the 1947 partition plan, as well as in the 1948 Declaration of Independence. The partition plan perceived both the Arab and the Jewish residents of mandatory Palestine as Palestinian citizens, who should be recognized by the international community as two people based on their national identities, thus establishing two nation-based independent states. One is a Jewish state, and the other is an Arab state. Besides, each state was expected to apply a constitutional democratic regime, that which provides constitutional protection of civil and political rights to all citizens alike, as well as a special set of collective rights to the national minority in each state, the Arab minority in the Jewish state and the Jewish minority in the Arab state. To this extent, the partition plan stepped hand by hand with the new post-World War II concept of constitutional democracy as distinguished from the notorious formal democracy of the Weimar Republic. Correctly, Israel's Declaration of Independence has adopted the same terminology and merit of the partition plan, and it is in this shape that I wish Israel to be crystallized in 2035. I believe that Israel should remain a Jewish and democratic state as it was originally established, yet striking a proper balance between its Jewish identity and its democratic identity. This will be possible only if Israel decides, as a matter of principle, to adopt the positive universal peculiar pillars of each of these identities. This will be indeed possible if Israel acknowledges that democracy and Judaism are not values in themselves, but rather means to achieve other idealistic values. We should remember that both Judaism and democracy can bring upon destructive consequences if only abused by a governmental power, and that at the same time both can establish constructive hopes if only adhered to substantively. I believe that Israel should express its Jewishness through the right to return to all Jews, the Jewish official holidays, and the Hebrew as the official language of the state. The right to return for Jews is the golden key granted to the Hebrew nation, or the Jewish nation, you name it as you wish, as such, in order to enter the Israeli house. As a Jewish state, Israel is the homeland for the Hebrew nation, thus entitling all its members as a special key to enter the house. However, within the house, all should be treated as equally as possible. I believe that Israel should promote principles of constitutional democracy, thus lending itself to values of reason, fairness, and justice. Especially during the recent 6 years, and I imply something about the recent 6 years, there have been several rising governmental official voices that perceive democracy as nothing but a means to fulfill the needs and the wishes of the electoral majority, whatsoever these are and as much as immoral they might be. This is a wrong concept which has been proven to be even dangerous. Insofar as the judiciary is concerned, the Supreme Court of Israel should keep playing an important role in advancing and protecting values of substantive constitutional democracy, thus aiming at protecting the rights and the liberties of minorities against any possible abuse of power by the majority. Recently, Israel's Supreme Court has been the subject of intensive, immoral, illegitimate, and inciting attacks, primarily by right-wing politicians who perceive themselves to be superior to the rule of law. I am confident, and I apologize in advance for this confidence. I am confident that this incitement against the court will end up with another tragedy of assassination of a Supreme Court justice if not met promptly with an iron hand by the state general attorney. In a state where the judiciary is not independent, in a state where the judiciary is politically affected, and in a state where the judiciary seeks to satisfy that which sounds politically sexy and trendy, one cannot expect but a regime of monarchy. This cannot be the case in Israel. I believe that in 2035, the Arab minority citizens of the State of Israel must have a better and clearer understanding of their multiple identities as Israeli citizens on the one hand, as Arab nationals on the other hand. The geographic, historic, and cultural nexus between Israeli Arabs and the Arab Palestinian citizens of mandatory Palestine does not make them Palestinians, of course not more than the Jewish Palestinian citizens of mandatory Palestine. I believe that in 2035, the Arab minority citizens of Israel do not have to be Zionist, nor do they have to be patriotic to the State of Israel, yet must they be loyal. Patriotism expresses solidarity, which crosses all political, national, and international boundaries, whereas loyalty embodies a contractual relationship between the state and its citizens. Israeli Arabs' nationality as Arabs does not and must not undermine their citizenship as Israelis, nor does their citizenship vis-à-vis their nationality. So must the State of Israel be loyal to its Arab citizens, thus avoiding treating them as fifth column whenever they oppose any governmental policy, even at times of war. I believe that Israeli Arabs should have the absolute inherent right to feel solidarity now in 2035 toward their Arab brothers from other Arab countries, and in particular the Arab Palestinians. In the course of expressing their solidarity, Israeli Arabs may and should be allowed to invoke all legitimate legal, social, and political means, but still they may not raise an arm in the face of the State of Israel, exactly as the State of Israel should not have raised an arm against them in October 2000. I believe that in 2035, Israel may be as close to utopia as close to dystopia. Of course, there are many things of which Israel can be proud of. It goes without saying, though, that if Israel keeps asking the same question according to which magic mirror on the war, who is the first one in the Middle East? The magic mirror will always respond, my queen, you are the first one in the Middle East. But a country that aspires to compete with Western enlightened democracies in the world cannot afford being compared with the Middle East jungle. A country which perceives itself a palace must aspire to be compared with other palaces in the world. I believe that in 2035, Israel's Arab and Jewish citizens should treat each other, all the more so themselves, of course, as insiders, not outsiders to the State of Israel. It is their duty to draw a rosy picture of their own reality. It is for both of them to adhere to legitimate means of political power, judicial review, and other permissible social and administrative methods of struggle in order for all existing forms of discrimination to disappear. I believe that in 2035, both Israel's Arab and Jewish citizens must be active in patching up the gaps. So must do the State of Israel as the ultimate regulating governmental power. For tango, we need a well-coordinated couple, not necessarily great lovers. Patching up the gaps between the majority and the minorities shall not be solely the concern of minorities, who must day and night give up their rights, suffocate their freedoms, and limit their liberties. This must also be primarily of the utmost concern of the majority, who must strike a balance between its own interest and the rights of the minorities, thus expressing tolerance and compassion toward the latter. Moreover, in a diverse state, such as the State of Israel, the urgent involvement of governmental power is required in order for all means of reconciliation to be achieved. I believe that in 2035, Israel should alter its flag and anthem, thus speaking to all Israelis alike. If Israel's flag and anthem are symbols of the state, then they must reflect the statehood identity of Israel, namely its Israelness, not its national identity as a Jewish state. This way, Israel does not negate its Jewishness, since as such Israel is defined already as a Jewish and democratic state. But at the same time, it will embrace all Israelis alike, the Jews and not the Jews. And for instance, the anthem shall not speak of the Jewish spirit is yearning deep in the heart, but it could be altered in a way that it says the Israeli spirits are yearning deep in the heart. Ladies and gentlemen, now I would like to become a prophet. If Israel will not take the initiative to become a better nation, a better state, I'm afraid that in 2035, Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews will drive in separate roads. They will take separate buses, and they will be fighting each other publicly day and night in street as well as in narrow passageways. This will not be, though, a regime of institutional segregation, rather the ramification of unwise institution governmental policies. Then the sense of hatred that we view here and there nowadays will become the rule, but not the exception. If that happens, I can assure you then that state diplomacy cannot extinguish the flames. Rather, it is very likely that the flames will burn anyone who encounters its way, as innocent, as complicated as he might be. If Israel will not regain its composure promptly, it will be neither a Jewish state nor a democratic state. Then the term Jewish and democracy will be nothing but a suicide package. Then Israel will lose its moral legitimacy as a Jewish and democratic state. I don't want this to happen. I am sure that there is an alternative way, and it's only for us, all Israelis, Arabs and Jews alike, to take our fate in our hands. The German philosopher Wittgenstein once argued that there is one thing of which one can say neither that it is 1 meter long nor that it is not 1 meter long, and that is the standard meter in Paris. Many of the controversial criteria in any society are considered absolute, whereas in fact they are arbitrary. However, not all criteria are as arbitrary as the standard meter in Paris. There are issues where it's possible, and if it's possible, it's only right to endeavor in determining the just criteria. It is true that history is an important point of departure for every process, for he who has no past has no present and future. Yet still is it also true that history is not an end in itself, but rather the end of the beginning. Reconciliation is a compelling interest for both sides of the conflict. Reconciliation does not imply forgetfulness, nor does it require forgiveness. Reconciliation demands admission, confession, willingness to reach a new beginning, and readiness to strike balances and to pursue that which is reasonable and proportionate. In the course of revealing my beliefs before you today, my brain led me one way, but my heart another. My national identity as an Arab took me to one place, but my statehood identity as Israeli took me to another. And my patriotism swayed me to one side, but my loyalty to another. I was torn. I was torn between my national identity as an Arab and my citizenship identity as Israeli. I was further torn between my patriotism to the Arab nation and my loyalty to the state of Israel. I was also torn between Israel as a democracy and Israel as a Jewish state. I was primarily torn between me and myself, between the brain and the heart. Like a school of dolphins, most Israelis, Arabs, and Jews have lost their way deep in a stormy sea. One wave throws them up, another pushes them down to the bottom of the sea. They struggle day and night for coexistence in a sea of bloody hatred. They keep swimming in that stormy sea, wishing for the sunny day to come, thus enjoying the glory of the sea. But the sea refuses to accept them, and the stormy waves insist to throw them out to the shore, where they are most likely to get suffocated and find their death. And yet the school of dolphins refuses but to struggle against the waves. It has been said that when weapons speak, the muses fall silent. Nevertheless, we are not muses, and therefore, especially when the cannons roar, the brain must not stop functioning. I am a proud Arab national, and I'm also a proud Israeli citizen. I praise the Arab nation for many things, and I compliment the state of Israel for many things as well. At the same time, yet, I criticize the Arab nation for lots of things, and I criticize Israel for further lots of things. However, in both cases, I do this as an insider, but not as an outsider. I do this because I care about the Arab nation exactly as I care about the state of Israel. This is my nation, and the other is my state. I have no other nation but the Arab nation, and I have no other state but the state of Israel. However, we come to beginnings only at the end, and from small beginnings come great things. Yet, there are some things which cannot be learned quickly, and time, which is all what we have 20 years from now, must be paid heavily for their acquiring. They are the very simplest things. Thank you very much.
So now you all know why we invited Muhammad. Thank you all for these very personal, but also very, I think, far-reaching and more than just subjective reflections. And I actually just would like to open up the floor right now because I know it is late, and I imagine a lot of you have questions or comments. And we'll start with Tudor Parfit. Where is the mic?
Well, thank you to everybody. It was a really very interesting colloquium. I'd like to take up the question of Hebrew, which you brought up. It was very, very interesting. And I mean, I think it's clear that Hebrew's been an enormous success over the last, well, what is it, 140 years, something like this. And, you know, Muhammad speaks it for a start, and you speak it as an American Jew, and I speak it as a Welsh Christian. And I know Tutsis that are learning it, and so on. And, you know, there's a school in Nicaragua where people are wanting to learn Hebrew. So it really has been an extraordinary international success. You all know this, but I'd like to make a point. And it's got to do with the Haredi community, because that's been one of the issues over the discussions today. And the Haredi community have been, in my view, quite unfairly excluded from the triumphs of the Zionist enterprise, whereas in many respects they're the underpinning of the Zionist enterprise, and particularly in the case of the Hebrew language, when everybody here knows that you know, the great moment in the revival of Hebrew is when Ben Yehuda arrives in Palestine in 1881, and he didn't really sort of speak Hebrew particularly well, but on the way to Palestine, he's there on his honeymoon with his fiancée, and going down the Danube. He says before they take off on the boat, "You've got to speak Hebrew to me from now on. You know, this is going to be the language of this marriage." And there's a famous moment when she says what's regarded as being the first Hebrew words ever spoken by a Jewish woman in the modern period. And the words were, if I remember correctly, Ma na'eh hamakom hazeh. What a beautiful place this is, as they were passing a mountain on the Danube. This is part of the mythology of the Zionist movement. Yeah? This is the beginning of Hebrew. And yet, when Ben Yehuda arrives in Jerusalem and the couple have a child, the child is brought up by a nanny who's taken from the Haredi community, who's a Hebrew speaker. And the whole revival of Hebrew has very little to do with Zionism in a way. It was the achievement of the Haredi community who'd kept Hebrew alive for 2,000 years and who used it in even spoken form in Palestine, in the cities, as a lingua franca. And I think one of the bridges to bring the Haredi community back into the community of Israel would be to acknowledge this fact and to recognize the amazing role that they played in the revival of Hebrew and the continuation of Hebrew.
wants to address Jim and Fania? Jim and Fania?
I would only second that. I think that sometimes that's forgotten also because, particularly in this country, with the complicated relationship that people have to Yiddish as both a language that is associated with American entertainment, with humor, and with the Holocaust, the specter of Haredi Jews speaking Hebrew is often a cognitive dissonance, you know. And it's a complicated story, but I think you're right there. I would only build on that and take it back to something Mohammed said, which is that, you know, what I think will help to realize the vision for what Israel can be, that it can hold different peoples inside it and have a Jewish nation and an Arab nation and have an Israeli state. One way for that to happen, I think, is for Jews elsewhere to write themselves into the story of the nation, not just the state. Right, and to identify not just with the fortunes of the state. And that's why I come back to this message of language, because that's a way to actually literally have that conversation, not just to have that association, but to have that conversation as part of a nation which has a language, just as an Arab nation can have a language which so defines it perhaps more than anything else.
I want to thank both James and Tudor for raising my most beloved issue of the Hebrew language, and I will shut up after about an hour. No. A couple of things here. You are absolutely right, and you are absolutely right, as the Rebbetzin said in the joke, and yet we do need to clarify something. In one sense, the Hebrew language is the greatest, most successful linguistic start-up of the 20th century. And yes, you can call it the greatest accomplishment of Zionism alongside the Jewish state, the kibbutz, and Tel Aviv. This is the array of the great Zionist innovations. Why do we call it the greatest linguistic startup? After all, I'll get back to the Haredim in a second, because it is viable to say that in the year 1880, no one in the world spoke Hebrew on an everyday, morning to night basis as a profane, corporeal language. No one. Not even the Haredim. To this day, by the way, when you go deeper into Bnei Brak, Hebrew is replaced by Yiddish because Hebrew is still meant to be sacred and not everyday. So, yes, the Haredi nanny of Itamar ben Avio, ben Zion ben Yehuda, she could speak Hebrew to him, but back home, I think Hebrew was mainly the sacred rather than the profane language. And that's why we say that 0 people spoke Hebrew as an everyday language in 1880. Today, a conservative, cautious estimate puts the number of everyday Hebrew speakers at well over 10 million, including Palestinians, including some other people in the Middle East, some Egyptian friends of mine, including many Jews and Israelis out there around the globe. Over 10 million, and I can never tire of saying, even if Michael has heard me before, that we have bypassed Danish. More people speak Hebrew today than Danish. We are very soon, if not at this moment, bypassing Swedish. More people are speaking Hebrew today than Swedish as an everyday language. And what I love best, Austrian German. Think about it.
Herzl wouldn't have liked that.
But I do. Herzl missed that one. He missed out on it. Although already Chobevei Tzion was speaking Hebrew, Alt-Neuland does not recognize Hebrew. They speak German in Haifa, going to the theater in German, the Arabs and the Jews of Haifa, for heaven's sake, Gottes Willen. But going back to this wonderful thing, the Hebrew language, what I found troubling, something you said which is very true, is today for the first time, Hebrew seems to be a divider rather than the uniter. Because, you know, we have, for heaven's sake, we have a 16th century document about a Polish Jewish merchant who made his way to India. Can't remember where in India. And he met a local Jewish community, and how on earth could they speak? Only Hebrew. That was the great uniter of Jews across borders. Nowadays, the 2 remaining great Jewish languages, as we say in the book Jews and Words, are Hebrew and English. That's why we wrote our book in English as a bridge. But I do not believe that the Hebrew language will remain a divider for long. You guys, some of you guys, will need to leap headlong into it and get some Hebrew. And we already have some English. And for heaven's sake, please abolish this Sunday school Hebrew thing. They don't like it, your kids, your grandkids. Let them listen to Israeli rock music instead. Believe me, they'll get some good Hebrew.
Let me just say one word. Of course, Herzl, as we all know, was less enthusiastic, as he said, how can one speak a language in which one cannot even buy a train ticket? But I wanted to say just one word about the Haredim, maybe a little bit different, because I think, and I'm missing Calvin Goldscheider tonight, who brings the numbers, and the numbers are very important. So we may give or may not give credit to the Haredim, to the ultra-Orthodox, of preserving the Hebrew language. Although I would even say over 2,000 years, it was all Jews who preserved. There wasn't the concept of Haredim before the modern period, in a way. But today, there were, in 1990, the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredi population constituted about 3% of the Jewish population of Israel. A few years ago, it was about 9%. And in 2035, it's somewhere between 20 and 25% of the Jewish population of Israel. And that was one thing I was just missing a little bit, because imagine, every fourth Jew in Israel may be an ultra-Orthodox Jew. I say maybe because I'm not exempt from the fools in prophecy. That's just what demographers say today. Every fourth Jew may be an ultra-Orthodox Jew, and also the other Orthodox population, the non-Haredi population, of course, is also growing. And who are the people who are in Berlin and who are in Los Angeles? They are not the Orthodox and not the Haredim, unless they were there before. The ones who are leaving are the secular ones. So I think this is, if I would say one thing, this is something which, as a secular Jew, would concern me a little bit in Israel in 2035. Because the understanding of a Jewish and democratic state, as you know, is a very different one in both of these groups.
Hi, my name is Stanley. I'm a recent graduate from the Elliott School of International Affairs at GW. I guess my question is more for you, James. This year we've seen, especially with the debate on the nuclear deal with Iran, the division within the American Jewish community has really been shown more publicly, and more American politicians, specifically from the Democratic Party, have been more vocal about their displeasure with Israeli policies, specifically in the West Bank, than in the past. Do you think this division will grow between American Jews and Israeli society, in which it's turning, seems to be turning more right-wing, and it goes against a lot of the liberal values of American Jewry? And with the changing demographics within the United States, with growing minorities getting more political presence, how will that affect the close U.S.-Israeli relationship politically?
Let's collect a few questions.
Hi, I'm Margot Blank, and I'm a student here at AU. I was wondering, American Jews, especially ones that are my age, have all these great cultural tools and resources. We have Hebrew classes and Jewish groups like Hillel and even J Street and Jewish overnight camps and USY and, so many tools and cultural connections. And, we all have this implied love of Israel from our parents and our friends, but how can we better use these sort of cultural connections not only to create a better Israel for the future, but also to create better conversations about Israel, because now with social media, everything is so isolated and ridiculous. And honestly, until this past summer, I had never met an Arab Israeli in my life before, and I'm 19 years old, So how can we, how can we like better use what we already have to create something new and real and important?
Hello, everyone. My name is Ariel Klausner. I may or may not be related to Fania.
What? You are kidding.
I still have the Klausner. Fania is my cousin. I'm an exchange student at GW. I study international relations at IDC in Herzliya, Israel, here for one semester. My question is for Fania and for Muhammad mainly. James can feel free to answer as well. I'm going to refer to the two scenarios you described, Fania, not the worst case scenario, because we all know how that ends, but more to the deliberation between extremism and moderation in Israel and in the Middle East in general. I think that most people would agree nowadays that the main cause for this extremism is, I'll say, religious extremism. And my question to you is, in light of this, in light of the fact that we see that what's leading to extremism, both Arab terrorism, Jewish terrorism, is this taking of an idea of concepts from religion and turning them into extreme motives. Is there any way to maintain Israel as a moderate, democratic country, thus avoiding your second scenario and driving Israel more towards the third scenario, other than, I don't want to say secularization, because Muhammad referred to this and he said that there should be a place for non-Israelis. I too believe this, but nowadays, I mean, we do see religious parties in Israel. We do see how religion controls a lot of the democratic process. So other than this secularization, or if you support it, of course, do you think there are more ways to promote this moderation in Israel, to prevent Israel from turning into another extremist country in the Middle East, kind of throwing off the balance of power, and we don't know how that ends, scenario number 2. So yeah, thank you for your
Thank you.
answers.
My name is George Johnson. I'm an editor at Moment Magazine. I have a question that takes off on your point about Hebrew. It seems to me that what I haven't heard too much about is taking steps in the direction that we want to go, and that is, I think, reconciliation. And one way, it seems to me, is if every Israeli spoke Arabic and every Arab Israeli, the Palestinian for that matter, spoke Hebrew. And perhaps, my idea is that if you can't communicate, you can't talk to each other, then how are you going to understand the other person? And I think that's a barrier that maybe we could overcome. Maybe I'm wrong about this, but I'd like to hear your thoughts.
One more.
Hi, I'm Zach, University of Pennsylvania. I feel compelled to ask this question, and I'm sorry if it's a bit blunt, but it seems missing because I think that you can't really understand the history of Zionism and the history of Israel without taking a look at the history of Palestinian nationalism and the history of Palestine. And so I feel compelled to ask, as rude as it might be, because it seems absent from your two scenarios and from your scenario describing the future of Israel and its Israeli Arab citizens, where's the occupation in 2035?
Who wants to start? Maybe the opposite order.
Since 2006, going back to your question, young lady, I have been involved intensively with collaborating with the Jewish organizations in Canada, in America, and in Europe, especially the Jewish Federation, J Street, and the Hillel. And my argument is the following. They are doing a good job in letting you know your nationhood identity, but they are doing nothing to let you know your citizenship identity in case and you decide to go to Israel. The common ground for all Israelis alike, Arabs and Jews, is being Israelis. Now, I did not expect this identity to be existing in the area back in 1948, but Israel is not a young country anymore. It is 67 years old. It's almost retired. At this stage of time, there is a common characteristics for most Israelis. You know what? Take the negative characteristics. The Israeli chutzpah. I will bring an Israeli Arab to this room, an Israeli Jew to this room. I will prove to you how they will be, I don't want to say nerve, but having the Israeli chutzpah to stand and speak publicly and defend their cases whatsoever, even without any rule of courtesy. So that's one thing. It's not enough to go to Israel for a tour of 2 weeks and to get to see all the nationalistic and religious symbols. You have to be there and understand that, the Arab people are not only about hummus and knafe, and the Jewish people are not just about military and occupation. It is more than that. It's beyond that. To your question, I think, although I'm not a big fan of the Ottoman Empire, but I think the Ottomans were a bit smart about the way they control the region. Insofar, they put religion on one side and secular life on another side. And the way they divided Jerusalem, by the way, to 4 quarters, that was amazing, right? And this is the hope for the future, maybe, how the Jerusalem issue could be resolved. Now, I am aware that Islam nowadays is located somewhere in a very problematic place. But I have a hope. I have a hope because I know that Islam was not like that, at least at the time of Prophet Muhammad. And by the way, I'm not a religious person, but I know a bit about religion, about Islam. I have a hope also because I know that the Abbasi and the Umayya empires, Islamic empires, were way far from the way Prophet Muhammad perceived Islam, and they looked exactly like ISIS, by the way. But I know that immediately afterwards, the Islamic empire was way better, and it exported to the world great notions of enlightenment. And now they are retreating, going back. But I have a good hope because I know that the Christians were not in their best. And I don't want to touch this topic now. It might be too much provocative. So if that worked for the Christians, there is a hope that it will work also for the Muslims. The last issue is the language. As a matter of fact, most Arabs in Israel and the Palestinians speak Hebrew. Many of them speak Hebrew better than the Jews. I'm afraid to say that whenever I meet a Jew who speaks Arabic, I have to guess one of 2 options. It is either that he works for the Shabak, the Israeli Secret Service, or that he has some Arab origins if he came from Arab countries to Israel. This way or the other, the language expresses culture. It's not just a means that we use to talk to each other. We don't need to know Arabic for the sake of being able to have intelligence in the Arab community or to be able to order a plate of hummus. It doesn't work like that. We need to understand Arabic in order also to understand the close sentiments of the community. It is funny that when there is a soccer game between a Sakhnin, an Arab soccer team, and Bitar Yerushalayim, a Jewish, well-known right-wing, at least the supporters of that team, every time the Arab team, although there are Jewish players in there, score, they shout and yell Allahu Akbar immediately. The Jewish supporters of Bitar get scared. They think they are going to explode themselves. But they don't understand when we say Allahu Akbar, we mean Elohim Gadol. That's the same thing. But if you understand the differences between a person who says Allahu Akbar when he is happy and another person when he explodes himself, then you will be able to treat the other side. You will be able to talk to him. You will be able to understand this from knowledge and culture.
Sure. To turn to other topics other than less controversial than soccer. About American politics, I would say simply we're in Washington, and there, what we have seen is that Israel has become a political symbol for battles between the right and the left in American politics, which I believe to have often very little to do with American Jews. One used to be able to say it was because American Jews voted in certain numbers, but as it's been pointed out by sociologists, American Christians are probably the greatest voting bloc that are pro-Israel, right? So I don't think it's a simple question of divides within the American Jewish community. We've actually been divided for some time. I mean, 20% of American Jews have been Republicans for 40 years. So that's a divide, and it's probably a greater divide. I mean, probably the ratio has changed. So I don't think that's really the issue, and I think in the Democratic side, there was a sense it was being politicized, but not that that was changing the democratic position on Israel. There's a remarkable continuity in that respect. So I think there's going to be more and more debates about Israel and American politics that may have less and less to do with American Jews. That's what I would put it. For the other issue, I would say simply that I've always felt that the birthright program, when it was created, had one fatal flaw, which that if you talk about rights, as lawyers will tell us, you have to talk about obligations also. And American Jews have done a very good job of dreaming up ways to promote very short-term engagements of young American Jews to Israel, but they've never come with any sense of chova, right? They never come in any sense that there's something that ought to be given. And I think that this is something on the right and the left of the American Jewish world today that could be improved, which is the sense that, as the late, I think, Rabbi David Hartman used to say, he didn't care if people were Reform Jews or Orthodox Jews, but to be better Reform Jews or better Orthodox Jews, which is to say, to be better at what they profess to be and claim to do. So I think if, for the left, there is a way to be a better leftist, even a non-Zionist Jewish leftist today, and engage with Israeli society, because certainly the left and the further left in Israel would be happy to have that support. And the same thing's true on the right. And oftentimes what happens is a strange kind of outsourcing of identity. I think that Mohammed's words talking about American Jews to claim their national identity would sound strange to many American Jews because they're so prone now to identify with Israel, but to disavow any identity which is a strong ethnic or national identity, perhaps for reasons of history we don't have to go into now. So I would say, what we have to do is find better ways for young and all American Jews to engage more directly with Israeli society, and not to view it simply as a place that you support through money or through social media or through tourism. But you find other ways to connect to the real place, and maybe we should just start with reading more Hebrew.
Okay, so can you hear me? Michael says this is the last round, so my role now, I'm going to try to use George's question as my starting point, weave a response that would try to cover all the questions asked in this round, and kind of wrap up the discussion in a way that will give you a solid, sound, well-argued sense of hope. And all this in 3 minutes. Let's give it a try. You see, when you ask George about languages, Arabs learning Hebrew, all Arabs educated in Israeli schools learn Hebrew, and I'm absolutely in agreement with Mohammed that some of them end up with far better, more poetic, more literary Hebrew than most Hebrew speakers. But whereas in the old days, most Jewish kids learned Arabic at school, today very few of them do, and those who do, it's often, as you rightly said, oriented towards some kind of a military purpose. Strangely enough, last week, a new legislation initiative was tabled in the Knesset for all Jewish kids to start Arabic at Kita Aleph, first grade in primary school, and all Arab kids Hebrew. And guess who tabled this enacted legislation? Oren Chazan, the clown of the Knesset, the womanizer cum gambler. This shady character, every Knesset has one or a dozen, and Oren Chazan is, who knew? Oren Chazan, and I don't know what he had in mind, but from first grade, Arabs doing Hebrew, all Jews learning Arabic, this is impressive. Maybe Oren Chazan is not what we thought. I'm a novelist's daughter, I'm telling you. Not everybody is what we think they are. Even in Israeli politics, I'm impressed by this initiative. And I want to continue, exactly from this point, to talk about what it means to think out of the box in Israel today. And this responds to Ariel, and to some degree perhaps to Zach, and to the young lady who asked us about what American Jews can contribute. You see, all Israelis obviously think out of the box all the time. Sometimes I fear that we have forgotten how to think in the box. And most Israelis, including some of my best high-tech friends and cousins, are also convinced that thinking out of the box is costless. It's simple, pure fun. But it's not. There is a price also for thinking out of the box, because you need to move out of your comfort zone. I've been doing it the last few years, not just by thinking that maybe Oren Chazan has a good side to him. I've also been methodically and continuously addressing audiences in Israel, which are not my home turf audiences. I've been talking to settlers. I've been talking to vast audiences, especially in Jerusalem, of religious Zionism. I've been talking to people who tried to shout me down in the beginning and then started listening. This is not my comfort zone. This is not Tel Aviv. But I try, because I think I ought to. Some of my Tel Aviv friends don't like it, but I think we ought to. We need to talk to people who are in total disagreement with us, not just between Jews and Palestinians, that's easy for the left, but between left and right. This is my attempt to think out of the box and move out of my comfort zone. I think that Muhammad you might consider thinking out of your moving out of your comfort zone by becoming a representative of Israel. I think you should join our minister. No, the Knesset, forget it. I don't wish that on you. I think you should join our Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I think you should become an ambassador. I didn't say you would be comfortable, but hey, we are talking about thinking out of the box. As to the two-state solution, which Zach raised, maybe it's time to think about alternatives. I don't like it. I still strongly believe in the two-state solution. But we should think out of the box, both about the two-state solution or maybe some other kind of a two-state solution, maybe even a three-state solution, leaving Gaza out of it. Maybe a four-state solution, a Haredi Israel, a Chiloni Israel, and two Palestines. You name it, we can play all sorts of games. But open up. Open up. I'm not willing anymore to be buttressed and locked up in one position and in one future scenario. And finally, American Jews. Let me say something that I've never said before to an American Jewish audience, to friends of Israel abroad. Because it's only beginning to occur to me in very recent months. Your comfort zone is talking to people like me, like Mohammed, like other Israelis here in the room. I would like you to shift your efforts from talking with us, which is easy, to talking with the kind of Israelis who don't know you at all. Reaching out to the kind of Israelis who have very little acquaintance with the global situation, with what democracy, liberal democracy, is all about, with what the American founding fathers taught us, with what moderate Judaism of the 19th century taught us, be it liberal Orthodox or Reform or conservative. Reach out over my head for a change to those Israelis who are not part of our conversation, because the fate of Israel is in their hands, not in mine anymore. Please find a way, I'm not telling you how, to reach out to them, because with me and with Muhammad, it's easy. And hopefully, prophecies are no longer given to the fools alone. And to quote a family member of mine, just by way of finishing off, to quote a family member of mine, not Ariel, but another one, many clocks are ticking in the Middle East, many clocks are ticking in Israel. You never know when moderation will raise its ugly head again. You never know where creativity is likely to erupt. You never know where hope springs. Israel is full of energy. Israel is full of well springs. Israel is potentially full of hope. Have a good evening. Thank you very much.
Since the lady who asked the question about Israel is 19 years old, and I guess you still have time in life, I am well aware, to be honest. I mean, you guys don't know me that much. I have been working with the Foreign Ministry, and I still collaborate with them, so that's, I don't speak to the people who understand me only. What is happening recently, and again, I don't know if this is related or not related, but during the recent 6 years, on American campuses, there's a big split between different Jewish groups. Namely, he who dares to criticize the policy of the current prime minister is perceived to be anti-Israeli. That's a dangerous way to deal with Israel. You should support Israel, not worship a particular prime minister. Supporting Israel means to praise Israel when it does good things, to explain to the world what the good things that Israel does and exports to the world, but at the same time to know how to criticize Israel for bad things. This is how we build a better nation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all, and next time we won't invite you anymore, Fania. You just may invite the Deputy Foreign Minister or the Minister of Justice or someone else. It's really only my pleasure to thank everyone. For those of you who have been here in the last session, Professor Eli Reches had quoted former Russian President Yeltsin when he was asked to answer in one word how he felt, and he said good, and in two words said not good. And I'm tempted to say how I feel after this conference. In one word I would say good, and in two words I would say very good. Thank you. Have a good night.